Greetings, everyone. Before we begin, I'd love to know where and what time you're listening from. Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoy our stories, leave a like and subscribe so you never miss one. Now, turn off the lights, close your eyes, and relax. My real life, the 8 hours a day spent in front of a computer screen, was a landscape painted in shades of gray, a wasteland of spreadsheets and meaningless emails. But my kitchen was another world entirely. My small kitchen with its worn tiles and cluttered countertop was my sanctuary. There the world regained its color, its flavor, its texture. For me, cooking wasn't a hobby. It was a necessity, the only form of expression I knew. I was a good cook, methodical and precise. I could follow any recipe to the letter and achieve a predictable, satisfactory result. But I always felt something was missing. My dishes had technique, but they lacked soul. They were perfect copies, but without the genius of the original. I yearned for that spark of creativity, that intuition that separates the craftsman from the artist. I found them on a sleepless night while browsing obscure online auction sites. The listing was discreet, almost lost among dozens of modern kitchen gadgets. It belonged to an anonymous seller with no ratings, and the title was simple: Antique Chef's Knife Set from an Estate. The description was even stranger, a single sentence: for one who understands the price of flavor. The photos were dark, but they showed 3 handcrafted-looking knives with blades that seemed to have a rippling pattern and handles of a dark, polished wood. The bidding was negligible. No one seemed interested. I felt a strange impulse, an inexplicable attraction. I placed a bid far above the previous one and won. They arrived a week later, not in a cardboard box, but in a heavy, wax-sealed wooden case. It took some effort to open. Inside, nestled in faded red velvet, were the knives. As I opened the case, the scent of mineral oil and history filled my kitchen. They were more beautiful than the photos had suggested. There were 3: a chef's knife, a paring knife, and a filleting knife. The blades were not of a bright, shiny stainless steel, but of a darker metal, with the flowing patterns of Damascus steel that resembled storm clouds. The ebony handles fit my hand as if they had been carved for it. Their balance was perfect. They felt heavy, substantial, and as I picked up the first one, I could have sworn I felt a faint vibration, an almost imperceptible hum. They felt alive. I decided to test the chef's knife that same evening. I chose a simple recipe, a vegetable stew I had made 100 times, a dish whose every nuance I knew. I began to chop an onion, and then everything changed. The blade didn't cut the onion. It glided through it without the slightest effort, without the usual crunch. It was like slicing through water. My hands, which had always moved with a studied precision, began to fly. The knife seemed to anticipate my movements, guiding my wrist in a swift, confident dance. I chopped the rest of the vegetables at a speed I had never possessed. The diced carrots, the pieces of pepper, all were perfect, identical, as if cut by a machine. The process was intoxicating. I felt a surge of inspiration. Instead of following the recipe from memory, I began to improvise. I added a pinch of cumin, something I had never done. I minced some fresh ginger with the paring knife, which moved in my fingers with the agility of a scalpel. The filleting knife peeled the skin from a tomato with astonishing ease. I wasn't thinking, I was feeling. The kitchen, my kitchen, filled with aromas that were at once familiar and new, deeper, more complex. I wasn't following instructions. I was creating. When the stew was ready, I knew I had made something special. The color was more vibrant, the aroma more intense. I served myself a bowl and took the first spoonful with an almost reverential expectation. The flavor exploded in my mouth. It was a revelation. It wasn't my usual stew. It was something else. I could taste the sweetness of the carrot, the smoky hint of paprika, the subtle spice of the ginger, all in perfect harmony. But there was something more. The dish didn't just taste of vegetables, it tasted of home, of warmth, of the feeling of an autumn afternoon with rain tapping against the window and the heat of a fire in the hearth. It was a dish that didn't just feed the body but caressed the soul. I ate the entire stew in a state of trance of absolute wonder. I had crossed the threshold. Finally, I was an artist. The following weeks were a whirlwind of feverish creation. I cooked every day, every night. The knives were my brushes, the food my canvas. I made a beef steak that tasted of triumph, of achieving a long sought-after goal. A chocolate and raspberry dessert that held the bittersweet essence of first love. A simple chicken soup that tasted of the safety and comfort of a mother's embrace. My obsession grew. I began inviting my few friends over for dinner. One of those nights I invited Mark and Isabel. I spent 2 days preparing the menu. The energy in the kitchen was electric. My hands moved on their own. The knives danced. When they sat down at the table, I was exhausted, but exultant. The main course was a mushroom risotto. Mark took the first bite. He stopped. He set his fork down and looked at me, his eyes wide. Then a tear rolled down his cheek. Isabel looked at him, concerned. He just shook his head, smiling. He said it was incredible that for a moment he was 8 years old again, walking through the forest with his grandfather, smelling the damp earth and pine. He said the dish didn't taste like mushrooms, it tasted like his childhood. Isabel tried the risotto and fell silent, an expression of pure bliss on her face. I watched them, feeling the pride of a creator, but also a strange distance, as if I were watching a scene through a pane of glass. The first hint that something was wrong was subtle, easy to ignore. I began to feel perpetually tired, not physically but emotionally. A kind of apathy, an emptiness, which I blamed on the long hours in the kitchen. And I noticed that the food, my own creations, had started to taste different to me. While my guests were lost in praise, I could only perceive the flavors in a technical, analytical way. I could identify the ingredients, the acidity, the sweetness, but the magic, the emotional resonance was gone for me. I was like a deaf musician who can only feel the vibrations of his instrument. The night that changed everything, I decided to cook for myself alone. I wanted to recreate a special dish, one tied to my happiest memory. Spaghetti with seafood, the dish I ate with my former partner in a small restaurant by the sea on the last day of a perfect vacation years ago. That day, that dish, represented a moment of pure, simple happiness. I used the knives, the shrimp, the squid, the mussels. Everything was prepared with a supernatural precision. The tomato and basil sauce filled the kitchen with the scent of the Mediterranean. The final dish was a work of art. It had the look, the smell, the essence of that sunny day. And then, I tasted it. I was expecting an explosion of flavor, a torrent of happy nostalgia. But I felt nothing. It was pasta. It was seafood. It was tomato. It was technically perfect, delicious in a superficial sense, but completely hollow. The emotion, the soul of the dish, wasn't there. At least not for me. I ate the entire plate, growing more and more confused and disappointed, searching in every bite for the echo of the happiness I was trying to invoke. After dinner, I sat on the sofa, feeling strangely empty, depleted. I closed my eyes, trying to bring back the original memory of that day on the beach. I wanted to feel the warmth of the sun on my skin again, to hear her laugh, to feel the carefree joy of that moment. And I couldn't. The memory was there, but like a silent black and white film. I could recall the facts. We went to that restaurant, we ate that dish. I could visualize the scene as if looking at a photograph. But I couldn't feel it. The warmth, the joy, the love, the sense of contentment, all of it was gone. The memory was now a cold fact, a piece of data filed away in my brain, stripped of all its life. A cold sweat ran down my back. I looked toward the kitchen, toward the knives gleaming faintly under the light of the extractor hood. And then, with a clarity that froze my blood, I understood everything. The knives had not just helped me recreate the dish. They had taken the original memory, the pure feeling, and put it into the food. They had extracted the essence of my joy and cooked it, served it on a plate. And now, the memory was empty. The sublime flavor of my creations was not the product of my skill, but the cannibalism of my own soul. I was not an artist. I was the raw material. and I was consuming myself, one delicious dish at a time. The knowledge of the truth did not free me. It chained me. Every time I looked at the knives, now wrapped in a cloth and hidden at the back of a drawer, I felt their pull, a metallic whisper in my mind that promised glory in exchange for my being. The first few weeks were a torture of abstinence. I tried to go back to my old way of cooking with my old dull knives, but it was impossible. My hands, having known perfection, felt clumsy, alien. Every dish I prepared was a tasteless shadow of what I knew I could create. The food had lost its magic, and with it, my life had returned to its original gray. Worse still was the silence. My friends, accustomed to my miraculous banquets, stopped calling. How could I explain that the genius had left, that the artist had retired? The loneliness I had tried to fill with my cooking returned, larger and emptier than before, because now I knew the euphoria I was missing. One night, unable to bear the mediocrity any longer, I succumbed. I took the knives from the drawer. Their weight in my hands felt like being reunited with an old, forbidden love. But this time, it would be different. I would be the one in control. I would conduct an experiment, a test to confirm beyond all doubt the nature of the curse. I deliberately chose a memory, one of little emotional importance but vivid. The memory of falling off my bicycle as a child, the initial panic, the sharp scraping pain in my knee, and then the strange sense of pride in my first war wound. I focused on this chain of sensations as I prepared something simple, some scrambled eggs. As I whisked the eggs, I felt the pull, a cold suction in my mind. I held on to the memory, feeling the knives extract it, strip it of its essence. I finished cooking and tasted the result. The eggs were extraordinary. They had a complex flavor with an initial metallic note of fear, followed by a sharp earthy taste and a strangely euphoric aftertaste. They tasted exactly like my memory. Afterwards, I tried to remember the fall. The image was there, a film with no sound or feeling. I remembered the fact of it, but I could no longer feel the pain or the pride. The experiment was a terrifying success. From there, I descended into a new kind of madness. I thought I could outsmart the curse. If the knives fed on my emotions, then I would use the ones I didn't want. I became an alchemist of pain. I began to cook with my worst memories. The humiliation of my first firing became a bitter, complex stew that strangely fascinated the few people I gave it to. The agony of a romantic breakup became a frozen dessert with a flavor so desolate it brought tears to the eyes of those who ate it. My creations became dark, avant-garde. I was getting rid of my past, one painful dish at a time. But the relief I expected never came. Emptying myself of my bad memories did not make me happier. It made me emptier. The pain, the humiliation, the sorrow. Those experiences, as terrible as they were also a part of me. They were the scars that had taught me my limits, that reminded me of the mistakes I should not repeat. By cooking them, I wasn't healing them. I was erasing them. One day I went for a walk, trying to feel something. I went to the park. I saw children playing, their laughter filling the air. I waited to feel tenderness, or at least nostalgia for my own childhood. I felt nothing. I analyzed the scene with a cold curiosity, like a scientist observing insects. The laughter was an acoustic vibration, the play a kinetic expenditure of energy. I realized that by sacrificing my memories of joy, I had lost not just those moments, but the very capacity to feel joy. By cooking my first love, I had lost the capacity to feel affection. By cooking triumph, I had lost ambition. I was erasing my own emotional spectrum, pruning my soul down to just an inert stem. I was becoming a blank page, a man without joy and without sorrow, without triumphs and without failures. A serene, apathetic shell. The final revelation, the bottom of the abyss, came one night as I looked in the mirror. My face was that of a stranger. My eyes, once expressive, were two pools of indifference. I felt nothing. Not happiness, not sadness, not even the hunger that once drove me to cook. Only an inner silence, vast and gray. I had emptied myself almost completely. I realized I had only one last great memory, one last pure emotion that I had not dared to touch. The foundational memory of my love for cooking. It was a memory from my childhood. Me, about 6 years old, in my grandmother's kitchen. She wasn't there in the memory. It was just me, standing on a stool, mixing flour and water in a bowl. I remember the sticky feeling of the dough on my fingers, the smell of yeast, the warm sunlight coming through the window, and the feeling, a feeling of pure, simple creation, of wonder. The exact moment I discovered I could transform simple ingredients into something new. It was the most precious memory I had left, the core of my identity. And I knew the knives wanted it. It was the final dish in their banquet. I understood then the true nature of the curse. The knives offered a shortcut to genius, but the price was the very source of all creativity. Human experience. To be a perfect artist, I had to stop being a person. I went to the kitchen. I took out the knives for the last time. Their dark gleam seemed more intense, hungrier than ever. I got out a bowl, flour, water. I was going to make bread, the simplest and most fundamental act of creation. I was going to cook that last memory. But as my hands began to move, as I felt the familiar pull in my mind, the suction of the guest preparing for the feast, something in me rebelled. A final spark of humanity. No, I was not going to give it to them. I was not going to sacrifice the origin of my love on the altar of perfection. The moment I made that decision, the knives grew cold in my hands. I felt a pressure in my mind, a whisper that promised perfection, eternal applause, if I would just let them take that last memory. My own fingers, guided by the knives' will, tried to move with their usual grace, to reach for an exotic spice, to perform a complex cut. I had to fight my own hands, forcing them to be clumsy, to obey my imperfect will instead of theirs. It was a physical and mental battle. With a cry of rage and pain, I fought against the guidance of the knives. My hands, accustomed to their supernatural fluidity, became clumsy. I resisted their whispers. I forced myself to cook with my own awkward memory. I kneaded the dough too hard. I forgot a little salt. The shape of the loaf was irregular, rustic. The process was an ordeal, a battle for every movement. When I took the bread out of the oven, it was not a work of art. It was a little burnt on one side, pale on the other, but it smelled like real bread. My bread. I broke it apart with my hands and brought a piece to my mouth. It didn't taste of wonder or creation or the sunlight of my childhood. It tasted of flour, water, salt. It was imperfect. It was real. And it was the most delicious food I had tasted in months. I closed my eyes. I searched for the memory of my grandmother's kitchen, and it was there, intact. The feel of the dough, the smell, the warm light. It was still mine. I had won. The next day, I took the wooden case with the knives and drove to the nearest forest. I dug a deep hole under the roots of an old oak tree and buried them. As I threw the last shovelful of earth, I felt a part of me mourn, the part that longed for perfection, for applause, for the feeling of being a genius. But the other part, the part that had survived, felt free. I am no longer a culinary artist. I have returned to my gray life, my boring job, but the world no longer seems so gray. I have regained my ability to feel, both joy and sorrow. Sometimes when I cook a simple dish and it tastes good, I smile. I no longer seek perfection but authenticity. I have learned that true art is not born from a magical gift that consumes its creator. It is born from effort, from failure, from imperfect memory, from the messy and wonderful act of being human. The knives offered me a shortcut to feed others but left me starving. I chose the imperfect but honest bread because I discovered that the true flavor of life is not in the dishes we serve, but in the soul we have left after the cooking is done. My car has always been my sanctuary, a small space of metal and glass that isolates me from the world during the 40-minute journey home every night. I work the evening shift at a factory on the outskirts, a noisy and anonymous place where the hours are measured by the roar of machinery. That's why when I get out, After midnight and get into my old car, the silence feels like a physical relief. I come from a noisy life, from sharing flats with too many people, and this self-imposed solitude is something I deeply value. That nightly drive, with only the company of soft music from the radio and the orange glow of the streetlights, had become my decompression ritual. The moment I left the noise of the machines behind and prepared for the silence of my empty apartment. The road I take is one of those old national highways that winds between fields and industrial parks, a lonely place where urban legends find fertile ground to grow. And I, like everyone in the area, knew the most famous one of all, the one about the backseat passenger. The story was simple and universal, told in countless variations. A lone driver, at night, looks in the rearview mirror and sees for a fraction of a second the silhouette of someone sitting behind them. Terrified, they turn around, and no one is there. It's a silly story, a scary tale based on the primal fear of our safe space being invaded without us noticing. I had never given it the slightest credit. I had always thought it was the product of a tired mind and the shadows that play on the periphery of our vision, until it started happening to me. The first time was on a Tuesday night, a particularly dark and moonless night. I was driving, my mind blank, when my eyes fell on the rearview mirror out of sheer habit. And I saw it. It wasn't a clear figure, but a patch of darkness in the darkness, a shape in the middle of the back seat that shouldn't have been there. My heart skipped a beat. I whipped my head around with the suddenness of a spring, my gaze sweeping the back seat. There was nothing, just the worn upholstery and the reflection of distant lights in the window. The relief was immediate, but it left a residue of unease. It was a trick of the light, a shadow. I told myself it was my own tired brain projecting images where there were none. I even stopped the car on the shoulder, got out, and opened the back door to confirm the emptiness, feeling like a complete idiot under the starless sky. For a couple of weeks, that explanation was enough to keep the anxiety at bay. But the vision repeated. Always on the same stretch of road, a 5-kilometer stretch without a single streetlight, where the darkness was almost total. A quick glance at the rearview mirror, and there it was. The sensation of a presence, a silhouette sitting right behind me. Each time, turning my head revealed an empty seat. I started to develop a kind of phobia of the rearview mirror. I tried not to look, keeping my eyes fixed on the road, but it was an almost impossible impulse to suppress. The need to check to make sure was a constant itch in my brain. And every time I gave in, the shadow was there, waiting. I began an almost scientific process of elimination. I tried to recreate the shadow myself, placing my code in different ways on the passenger seat, but no configuration created that specific, vaguely human shape. I cleaned the rearview mirror and the rear window until they were spotless, removing any possible smudge or distortion. Nothing worked. The paranoia began to set in. Before getting into the car each night, I would thoroughly check the back seat, running my hand over the upholstery, looking under the floor mats, making sure it was empty. I felt ridiculous, but it was a ritual I needed to calm my nerves. However, as soon as I started driving and reached that dark stretch of road, the feeling returned. It was no longer just a vision. It was a physical sensation. The impression of a weight in the car that shouldn't be there, the subtle change in the suspension, the dense and heavy atmosphere inside the cabin. The air inside the car felt colder, heavier, as if the presence of an extra body were displacing the oxygen. The terror took a qualitative leap when the physical evidence appeared. One morning, as I went to get the car to go to work, I opened the back door to leave my jacket, and I froze. The seatbelt on the driver's side, the one directly behind me, was buckled. The red strap across the empty seat clicked into its buckle. I never, ever used the back seats. No one had been in my car in months. There was no possible explanation. I stood there for a full minute, staring at the taut strap, silent proof that someone or something had been sitting there. I felt a wave of nausea. I unbuckled the belt with trembling fingers, the click of the mechanism sounding like a gunshot in the morning silence. That night I drove home with a fear so intense that my teeth ached from clenching my jaw. The incidents became more frequent and bizarre. On a very cold night I arrived home, and before getting out of the car I glanced back out of habit. The rear window, the one behind me, was fogged up, but not uniformly. In the center of the glass there was a circular patch of condensation, the unmistakable mark of a breath, of invisible lungs exhaling air into the cold of my car. I waited, not daring to move, as the car's engine cooled and the other windows remained completely clear. I jumped out of the vehicle and stared at the window from the outside, watching as the patch of condensation slowly faded until it disappeared. Another time I began to notice a smell. It was a faint scent of damp clothes and rain that appeared only during my nightly drive and was gone by morning. It was the smell of someone who has walked for a long time in a storm. My sanctuary had become my cell. The claustrophobia of being trapped in that small space with an invisible presence was unbearable. I tried changing my route home, even if it meant a half-hour detour through better-lit streets. But it was no use. As soon as the city lights were behind me and the road became lonely, the feeling returned. The presence was not tied to a place. It was tied to the car. Or to me. One night, fed up with the torture, I decided to confront it. As I was driving through the dark stretch, I looked in the rearview mirror. The shadow was there, more defined than ever. Instead of turning my head, I took a deep breath and gripped the steering wheel tightly. "I know you're there," I said out loud. My voice sounded strange, trembling, absorbed by the car's upholstery. "I don't know what you want, but you're scaring me." The instant I spoke the words, I felt an icy cold fill the car. A cold so intense that the hair on my arms stood on end, and I could see my own breath. And in the rearview mirror, the shadow moved. It leaned forward, toward my seat. I couldn't see a face, couldn't see details, but I felt its attention, its curiosity. And then I heard a sound. It wasn't a voice, it was a click. The sound of the seatbelt mechanism in the back seat being unbuckled. I slammed on the brakes in the middle of the road, the car skidding slightly on the gravel of the shoulder. I stayed there, in the total darkness, with the engine idling, too scared to move, too scared to look back. The cold in the car was now piercing, and the smell of damp clothes was stronger than ever. The seconds passed, feeling like hours. I was trapped in a bubble of terror. I knew that if I turned around, this time I would not find an empty seat. The thing that traveled with me every night, my silent passenger, had decided it was time to introduce itself. The click of the unbuckling seatbelt was the loudest sound I had ever heard. It broke the spell of my paralysis, only to replace it with a new kind of terror, a sharper, more expectant one. I sat in the stopped car, in the middle of nowhere, with the engine vibrating beneath my feet. My first impulse was to get out, to run into the darkness, but my body refused to obey. I was convinced that if I turned my head, I would see something my mind couldn't handle. My only connection to reality was the rearview mirror, and my eyes were glued to it. The dark silhouette was still there, but now without the tension of the seatbelt it seemed larger, looser. It moved again, a slow motion, leaning forward. I could feel, more than see, its proximity to the back of my neck. The cold in the car was now so intense that the inside of the windshield began to fog over. I don't know how much time passed. Seconds or minutes. Eventually, I knew I couldn't stay there forever. I had to look. I had to know. With agonizing slowness, forcing my muscles to obey, I turned my head, and there was nothing. The back seat was completely empty. I felt a wave of relief so dizzying that I almost passed out. Had I imagined it all? The click, the cold, the shadow? But then, My eyes adjusted to the darkness of the cabin, and I saw two things that proved I was not crazy. The first was that the upholstery of the back seat, directly behind me, was dark, soaked, as if someone in dripping wet clothes had been sitting there. The second was the smell. The smell of damp clothes and rain was now so strong it filled the car, an aroma of earth and ozone. No, it wasn't empty. I just couldn't see it anymore. An impulse that was not my own made me release the brake. My foot moved to the accelerator. My hand, still clutching the steering wheel, turned it gently, returning the car to the road. I didn't want to drive. I wanted to get out of the car and run screaming into the darkness. But my body wasn't listening to me. It was as if my limbs were being controlled by an invisible puppeteer. I tried to fight, to turn the wheel in the opposite direction toward the city, but I felt a resistance, an intense cold that traveled up my arms from the steering wheel and paralyzed my muscles. I was simply a passenger in my own body, a terrified chauffeur for a client I couldn't see. The car accelerated, but it did not take the direction to my home. At the next intersection, my hands turned the steering wheel onto a secondary road I didn't know, a narrow path that led into the darkness of the countryside. I drove in absolute silence, too scared to turn on the radio. The only sound was that of the engine and my own frantic heartbeat. The presence in the back seat was a certainty. I could feel its weight, its cold, its strange and silent stillness. It didn't seem to be malevolent. It wasn't attacking me, not threatening me. It was simply there, and it was guiding me. The road became narrower and narrower, the asphalt giving way to a gravel path. The trees formed a dark tunnel over the car, their branches scratching the roof. The landscape was surreal, desolate, barren fields and rusted farm equipment that looked like the skeletons of prehistoric beasts under the moonlight. With every kilometer we traveled, I felt myself moving further and further away from the world I knew. After about 15 minutes of this somnambulistic journey, my hands turned again, entering a dirt track that led to a house. It was a small, isolated house, with peeling paint, a sagging porch, and a neglected garden where the weeds had eaten everything else. The windows were black, empty sockets. The car stopped on its own right in front of the main door. The engine cut out. The silence that followed was total. I waited, and then I heard the unmistakable sound of the rear car door opening, a groan of old hinges, then a soft click as it closed. I looked in the rearview mirror. The back seat was still empty, but the damp patch was larger and darker than before. And the door, the one I had just heard, was perfectly closed. I turned my head and looked toward the house, and then I saw him. Standing in front of the house's door, there was a figure. It was translucent, flickering, like an image from a faulty projector or the hot air that rises from asphalt in the summer. It was the silhouette of a young man, his clothes stuck to his body as if he were soaked. He didn't move. He just stood there, his back to me, looking at the door of his house for a long minute, a statue of sadness and longing. I understood everything in that moment. The urban legend was true, but it was incomplete. People told the scary part, the appearance in the back seat. But nobody told the end of the journey. The ghost wasn't a monster, not a threat. It was just a lost soul, trapped on the road where he had probably died in an accident, trying night after night to get someone to take him to his final destination, to his home. I felt a wave of pity that drowned my fear. He was so close. He was at his door, but he couldn't go in. For some reason, he couldn't take the last step. He was trapped on the threshold between memory and rest. I could leave. I could start the car and leave him there, condemning him to repeat his lonely journey night after night with other drivers, until maybe one went mad or had an accident out of panic. But I couldn't. After everything we had been through, I felt a strange responsibility. I got out of the car. The night air was cold, but it no longer felt threatening. I walked slowly up the weed-covered path toward the house, toward the flickering figure. As I got closer, the figure didn't turn. It kept staring at the peeling wooden door. I passed by its side, feeling a momentary cold, as if walking through a sheet of ice. I stood on the porch, in front of the door. The wood was rotten in places, and the paint was a dirty white shell. The house smelled of neglect and stopped time. I hesitated for an instant, my own logic fighting against what I was about to do. I felt the weight of the ghost's loneliness, a solitude so deep it had survived death itself. Then, I raised my hand and did what he, apparently, could no longer do. I knocked on the door. 3 dry, firm knocks that echoed in the silent night. The instant my knuckles struck the wood, the translucent figure turned towards me. For the first time I saw its face. It was that of a young man, not much older than me, with an expression of infinite sadness that, in that moment, transformed into one of pure gratitude. He didn't smile. He simply nodded once, a slow, solemn gesture, and then he vanished. He didn't disintegrate or fade away. He simply ceased to be there. The air regained its normal temperature. The feeling of presence was gone. I was alone in front of an abandoned house. I turned around and went back to my car. The back seat was dry. The damp smell was gone. I started the engine and retraced my path, returning to the main road to my own life. The journey back was strangely peaceful. The silence in the car was no longer tense. It was peaceful, as it had been before all this began. I drove with my own hands, and the car obeyed my orders without resistance. My car no longer feels like a cell. The back seat is empty, and the silence of my nightly drives has become peaceful again. I have learned that urban legends often get the most important detail wrong. They tell the scary part, but forget the reason. Sometimes, the terror that haunts us in the darkness isn't looking to harm us, it's just lost. And the only thing it needs is for someone finally to take it home. I am a piano teacher. My life, by necessity and by character, has always revolved around order and discipline, tempo, rhythm, structure. It's a control that I apply not just to music, but to my life. It gives me a sense of security. I taught my students that music, even in its most chaotic moments, is built upon a skeleton of predictable rhythm. My apartment, which was also my studio, reflected that philosophy. Everything was in its place, in a silence broken only by the scales and studies that my students or I practiced. It was a quiet, methodical, and above all, controlled life. The metronome arrived as a gift. It was a package sent by the family of a former student, a talented young man whose family had moved to another city. Inside, on a bed of wood shavings, was an antique metronome, one of those shaped like a dark wooden pyramid with a brass pendulum. It was a beautiful piece, much more elegant than the soulless digital model I used. In the attached note, the boy's mother thanked me for my patience and dedication, and told me that the metronome had belonged to her son's grandfather, a composer, and that they wanted me, as his mentor, to have it. I appreciated the gesture and placed the old metronome on my piano as a decorative piece. For several weeks I didn't use it. My usual digital metronome was sufficient. But one night, a sound woke me up. It was a rhythmic, fast and persistent click-clack. I got up, confused. The sound was coming from the living room. Upon entering, I saw that it was the wooden metronome. It was running, its brass pendulum swinging from side to side with a devilish speed. I approached it, puzzled. I hadn't started it. And the strangest thing was the position of the brass counterweight. It was at the highest part of the pendulum, at the mark that indicated the slowest tempo, largo. However, the rhythm at which it was moving was a frantic presto, much faster than the mechanism should have allowed. I stopped it with my finger, the pendulum vibrating under my fingertip. I thought it must be a defect in the old mechanism, a spring that had come loose. I left it still and went back to bed. But the next night, it happened again. I was awakened by the same frantic ticking, and again, the counterweight was in the slowest position. This time, I had more trouble falling back asleep. There was a quality to the sound, an insistence that made me nervous. On the third night, I decided to remove the pendulum before going to bed. I carefully unhooked it and left it on top of the piano. I went to bed feeling a little foolish but sure that the problem was solved. At 3 a.m, the click-clack woke me up. I ran to the living room. The pendulum was back in its place, swinging to its impossible rhythm. Now fear began to seep in. It wasn't a faulty mechanism. It was something else. The real terror began not with the metronome itself, but with the sounds that accompanied it. One night, as the metronome marked its impossible beat, I began to hear another sound synchronized with it. It was the dripping of the kitchen faucet, drop by drop, in perfect sync with the clack of the pendulum. I got up and turned the tap off tightly. The dripping stopped. But as soon as I returned to the living room, I heard a new sound keeping the rhythm. A small creak in the parquet floor, always in the same spot, as if someone were tapping their foot to the beat. Night after night, the entire house seemed to begin to obey the rhythm of the metronome. The heating pipes knocked in the same time. The hum of the refrigerator seemed to pulse at the same frequency. Even the blinking of a distant street light I could see from my window seemed to have synchronized with the infernal tempo. The natural, chaotic world of a house's noises was submitting to a rhythmic tyranny. My sanctuary of silence had turned into a percussion box, and the constant, fast and insistent rhythm got into my head. I began to feel it even during the day when the metronome was still, a phantom pulse in my temples. I would find myself drumming my fingers on the table, following that exact rhythm without realizing it. Once, while teaching a student, my own heart began to beat rapidly, and I realized with horror that it had synchronized with the memory of the nightly tempo. I was losing my own biological rhythm. My body was being tuned by an invisible instrument. I decided I needed to know more about its origin. I called the mother of my former student. After the usual greetings, I asked her about the composer grandfather, the original owner of the metronome. There was an awkward pause on the other end of the line. Her tone became tense. "It's not a pleasant story," she said. I insisted, telling her the metronome was a fascinating piece and I was curious. Finally, she told me. The grandfather had been an avant-garde composer, a man obsessed with the mathematical purity of music. He had become increasingly eccentric and reclusive, convinced he had discovered a fundamental rhythm that governed the universe and that if he could replicate it, he could control reality. He would spend days and nights locked in his studio with only the sound of his metronome. He was found dead one morning, sitting at his piano. He had died of a heart attack, but the strange thing, the woman told me, was that everything in the room, from the wall clock to a dripping faucet, had stopped at the same instant, and the metronome, according to the police, was still running. I hung up the phone with a sense of dread. The grandfather hadn't discovered a rhythm. He had unleashed it, and now it was in my house. I tried to get rid of the metronome. I put it in a box and threw it into a dumpster 10 blocks from my home. That night I slept soundly for the first time in weeks. The next morning, upon entering the living room, I felt my heart stop. The metronome was on the piano in its usual place. There was no logical explanation. It was clean, without a speck of dust. If I couldn't get rid of it, I had to fight it. My life was based on rhythm and order, but the order of this metronome was a perversion, a tyranny. I decided to fight it with its opposite, chaos, arrhythmia. One night, when the infernal ticking began, instead of trying to ignore it, I went to the living room and put music on my sound system. I didn't play Bach or Mozart. I put on the most chaotic record I owned, a free jazz album, an explosion of dissonant notes and broken rhythms. I turned up the volume, filling the apartment with a wall of sonic anarchy. My plan was to overload the atmosphere, to break the metronome's discipline with a musical rebellion. At first, it seemed to work. The sound of the metronome was almost drowned out by the dissonant saxophones and drums. But then, the click-clack began to change. It grew louder, sharper, cutting through the noise like a knife. I turned the music up louder, but the sound of the metronome rose with it, always maintaining its preeminence. And then, the rhythm changed. It accelerated even more, reaching a speed that should have been impossible for a clockwork mechanism, a rattling so fast it sounded like the buzzing of a giant insect. The chaotic jazz music began to falter, the speakers emitted a screech, and then the sound system shut off abruptly. The metronome had won. It was left ticking in the silence at its new, terrifying tempo. And then, in the silence broken only by the ticking, I saw something that chilled my blood. On the piano's music stand, there was a blank sheet of score paper I had left there that afternoon. And on the paper, on the lines of the staff, notes were appearing. They were drawing themselves, out of nowhere, a sharp, black script that formed at the exact rhythm of the metronome. It was a new melody, a composition being born at that very moment. The metronome wasn't just imposing its rhythm on the world. It was composing. It was writing its own work. The work of the mad grandfather, the song of the fundamental rhythm. And I knew, with an absolute certainty that filled me with a dread I had never felt before, that this was a melody that must never, under any circumstances, be played. The last note drew itself on the staff with a chilling finality, and in that same instant, the metronome's pendulum stopped in the center of its arc with a dry click. The silence that fell upon the room was deeper and more terrifying than the ticking that had preceded it. I stood paralyzed, staring at the sheet music. It was a single page, but it was densely covered in a strange and complex musical notation. It looked like nothing I had ever seen before. My first impulse, a visceral need, was to destroy that piece of paper. I lunged at the piano, grabbed the score, and ran to the living room fireplace. Without hesitating, I threw it into the unlit hearth and set it on fire with a lighter. The paper curled, the corners blackened, and an orange flame began to consume the notes. But the moment the fire touched the first line of the staff, a sharp pain, like an electric shock, shot up my arm. I cried out and fell backward. At the same time, the light bulbs in the house flickered violently and a glass on a shelf shattered into 1,000 pieces. I pulled the score from the flames with trembling hands, patting out the fire with my palm. The pain in my arm ceased instantly. The page was slightly singed at the edges, but the music, the impossible composition, was intact. I understood the terrible truth. The score was no longer just a piece of paper. It had become a physical extension of the curse. It was linked to me, to the apartment. To destroy it was, somehow, to destroy myself. I was forced to keep it. I stored it in the deepest drawer of my desk, under a pile of old papers, with the vain hope that if I didn't see it, I could forget it. But I couldn't. The melody began to play in my head. At first it was a whisper, a fragmented tune that would assault me in moments of silence. But as the days went on, it grew louder, more persistent, a constant, unwanted soundtrack. It was a dissonant melody, mathematically complex, but strangely catchy. It affected my work. While trying to teach a child a simple sonata by Mozart, my fingers, of their own accord, would try to stray towards the phrases of the forbidden melody. I would stop, sweating coldly, apologizing to the student's confused gaze. I heard the melody in the sound of traffic, in the song of birds, in the dripping of a faucet. The entire world was becoming an orchestra that performed my madness, and with the music came the compulsion, a dark, profound desire to sit at the piano and play it. It was an itch in my fingers, a tension in the muscles of my hands that only seemed to ease when I got near the piano. My hands, which had been my tools, my companions, now felt like traitors, eager to bring that forbidden melody to life. I began to fear my own piano. I avoided it, making a wide detour so as not to pass near it. I even covered it with a heavy canvas as if it were a corpse. But the compulsion grew day by day, a thirst that became increasingly difficult to ignore. I felt as if the dead composer and I were fighting a battle for the control of my own hands. I needed to understand what I was facing, not just its history, but its creation. With immense fear, I took the score out of the drawer. For days, I dedicated myself to analyzing it, not by playing the notes but by studying them on the paper, deciphering its structure, its harmony, its rhythm. What I discovered horrified and fascinated me in equal parts. The composition was a work of genius, but of a demented genius. It used harmonic progressions and rhythmic structures that were theoretically impossible. The key signatures changed mid-measure. The time signatures were irrational fractions. It broke the rules of music in a way that shouldn't sound good. But on paper it had an internal logic, a terrifying mathematical coherence. The fundamental rhythm the composer had sought was not just a tempo. It was a formula, a sonic equation. I tried to transcribe some of the phrases into my composition software on my computer, and the software crashed, unable to process the impossible structures. The score was not a song. It was an incantation, a code designed to resonate not with the ears but with the very fabric of reality. To play it would not just be to perform music. It would be to execute a program, a code designed to break something, to open a door. The compulsion to play it became almost irresistible. One night, I woke up to find myself standing in front of the piano, the canvas cover removed, my fingers hovering an inch from the keys. I had no memory of getting there. My body had moved while I slept, drawn by the will of the music. I ran out of the apartment and spent the rest of the night walking the cold city streets, fighting the urge to return and play. I knew I was losing the battle. Sooner or later, my defenses would crumble and I would play the song. And I didn't know what would happen then, but a part of me was sure it would be the end. If I couldn't destroy the music, and I couldn't resist it forever, I had only one option left. I couldn't erase it, but maybe, just maybe, I could change it. The composition's strength lay in its mathematical perfection, its inhuman logic. What would happen if I introduced an element of imperfection into it? A deliberate human error? The idea was madness, like trying to correct a sacred text. For a man like me who had dedicated his life to structure and the right note, it was heresy. But it was my only hope. I returned to the apartment with a new purpose. I took out the score and placed it on the music stand. I picked up my own pen, a simple fountain pen. The metronome on the piano, which had been silent for weeks, suddenly came to life. Its pendulum began to swing at its frantic pace without making a sound. A silent specter, as if it knew what I was about to do, encouraging me or perhaps warning me. I ignored the silent pendulum. I ignored the fear. The compulsion to play the piece was a physical pressure in my chest, a dull ache. My fingers wanted to move to the keys, but I forced them to hold the pen. I looked at the score, the sequence of perfect and terrible notes, and then I found a place, a measure in the heart of the melody. With a trembling hand, I made my small, humble correction. In the middle of a complex series of dissonant chords, I added a single note, a simple C major, which did not belong in the scale, which completely broke the mathematical progression. It was a note of almost childish simplicity, a note of hope in the middle of a storm of calculated chaos. It was an imperfection, an error, an act of humanity. The instant the ink from my pen dried on the paper, the metronome stopped with a dry crack as if something inside it had broken. The pendulum went still. And the score, the sheet of paper that had resisted fire, began to age at an impossible rate. It turned yellow, then brown, and finally it crumbled into a pile of fine, dark dust that scattered over the piano keys. The air in the room, which had always been tense and charged with an unnatural energy, relaxed. The compulsion in my hands disappeared. The silence returned, but this time it was a real silence, a peaceful silence. The metronome is now just a piece of wood on my shelf. I never heard its rhythm again. I have learned that absolute order, the mathematical perfection the composer sought, is a form of madness. Life, like music, needs its small dissonances, its imperfect silences. Sometimes the only way to defeat a monster of perfect logic is not with chaos, but with a simple, small act of humanity. A single wrong note that, in its imperfection, reminds us that we are still free. The difference between a dream and reality used to be, for me, a clear and well-defined border. In dreams, things didn't make sense. You could be in your childhood home but with the furniture from your current apartment, or talking to a friend who suddenly had a stranger's face. Logic would break, the rules didn't apply. Upon waking, that consistency, that boring and predictable A that always follows B, was the proof that you were back in the real world. It was comforting. But that border in my life began to blur. It all started with a particularly vivid dream. I dreamt I was walking down my own street, but the asphalt was grass and the street lights were tall, thin trees from whose branches hung bare light bulbs. I entered the doorway of my building and opened the door to my apartment, but on the other side wasn't my living room, but a quiet beach at sunset. I woke up with a sense of strangeness, but also a certain wonder at the creativity of my own mind. It was an absurd, illogical dream. It was just a dream. However, some of that illogic seemed to stick with me, like mud on a shoe. The first crack in my reality was small, almost insignificant. It was a couple of days after that dream. I left my car keys on the kitchen counter in the ceramic bowl where I always leave them. I turned around to get a glass of water from the tap, no more than a meter away. It was a movement of barely 3 seconds. When I turned back, the keys were no longer in the bowl. They were on the dining room table, on the other side of the kitchen. I stood still looking at the keys, the glass of water in my hand. I tried to reconstruct my actions. Had I walked to the table and left them there without noticing? It seemed impossible. My memory of the act was clear. I had left them in the bowl. But the physical proof, the keys on the table, contradicted my memory. I chalked it up to fatigue. A slip of the mind, a small mental lapse. It happens, but it started to happen more often. Small things, everyday objects, seemed to have a life of their own, but only when I wasn't looking. I would leave a blue pen on my desk, and upon returning from the bathroom, the pen would be red. I was sure it was blue. I remembered using it, the way the blue ink glided across the paper. But now, it was undeniably red. A book I was reading with a cover of a man looking out a window would transform into another book with an almost identical cover, but now the man had his back to the window. The title was different. The author was different. But my bookmark was still there, on the same page. I began to feel that my mind was betraying me. Was I developing some kind of memory problem? Agnosia? I lived in a state of constant, subtle confusion, doubting my own immediate memories. I started performing little checks, rituals to anchor myself to reality. Before leaving a room, I would memorize the position of objects. The remote control is to the left of the cushion. The coffee cup is next to the book. The cushion is gray. When I returned, sometimes everything was the same, but other times the remote was on the right. The cup had moved a few centimeters. The cushion now seemed to be a slightly greener shade. They were small changes, but they were cumulative. and each one was a small jolt to the foundations of my sanity. The phenomenon moved from objects to spaces. This was the escalation that took me from simple bewilderment to pure terror. One day, I got up from the sofa to go to the bedroom. I opened the hallway door, but for a split second on the other side wasn't my hallway. I saw a wrought iron spiral staircase descending into a dark cellar. I could smell the dampness and the wine. It was a perfect, sharp, and real image. I blinked, and the vision was gone. In front of me was just my usual hallway, with its worn carpet and white walls. I stood there, clutching the doorknob, my heart racing. My brain desperately tried to find an explanation, a hallucination, a micro-dream. But the image had been too real. From then on, the spatial inconsistencies became more common. The bathroom door that suddenly opened onto a garden. The living room window that for an instant showed a desert landscape instead of the buildings across the street. They were flashes, visions that lasted less than a second, but each one was an assault on my perception of reality. My apartment, my safe space, had become unpredictable, like a theater stage where the sets could change without warning. I began to move through my own home with a cautious slowness, fearing what I might find on the other side of each door. My social life disintegrated. How could I explain this to anyone? They would think I was crazy. I started turning down invitations, not answering the phone. I locked myself in my apartment, which was both my prison and my laboratory. I needed to understand the rules of this new, strange logic. I discovered that the changes only occurred when an object or a place left my field of vision. As long as I stared at the cup remained the same. But if I blinked or if I turned my head for a second, it could change. Reality seemed to need my constant observation to remain stable. It was as if the universe had become lazy and only rendered the correct version of things when I was paying attention. The loneliness and fear pushed me to seek answers in the only place I had left, the internet. I spent entire nights searching in obscure forums, using key phrases that made me feel like a lunatic. Reality changes when I'm not looking. Objects changing color on their own. Doors to other places. Most of the results were garbage, works of fiction, or people who were clearly unwell. But then, in a forum about lucid dreaming and paranormal experiences, I found a thread. The title was simple: The Unraveling. It had been written by an anonymous user more than 5 years ago, and in his first post, he described exactly what was happening to me: the changing of objects, the doors that led to other places, the feeling that reality was becoming inconsistent like a dream. He called it the unraveling because he felt as if the fabric of reality was coming undone, like an old cloth. Reading his words was a mixture of immense relief and absolute terror. I was not alone. I was not crazy. But the phenomenon was real. I devoured the entire thread. Only a few people had responded, some with skepticism, others sharing similar but less intense experiences. The original poster continued to write for several months, documenting how the glitches in his reality became larger and more frequent. He talked about how he began to lose fragments of time, looking at the clock and seeing that 2 hours had passed in what had felt to him like 5 minutes. He talked about how the faces of people sometimes seemed to blur, to become generic. The last post in the thread, the last one that user ever wrote, was dated almost a year after his initial post. It was short, and its words stabbed me in the soul. It said, "The problem isn't when things change. That's just the beginning. The real problem is when you start to be unsure of how they were before. You get used to the dream logic, and slowly you begin to forget what it was like to be awake." After reading that, I turned off the computer. I sat in the darkness of my office, my heart beating with a terrible calm. The stranger's final sentence echoed in my head. You begin to forget what it was like to be awake. I felt a profound sense of cold. I looked up from the dark screen. I was in my living room. I looked at the opposite wall, the one that faced the landing, the wall where the front door of my apartment should have been. There was no door. In its place, there was a smooth, white, uninterrupted wall. And my first thought was not of panic. It was not a scream. It was a cold, silent, and terrifying question I asked myself. Has there ever been a door there? I couldn't remember. The absence of the door was an absolute fact, a smooth white wall where my memory insisted there should be an exit. But the question my brain formulated, has there ever been a door there, was the true lock on my prison. Not being able to remember with certainty was more terrifying than the wall itself. The unraveling, as the stranger from the forum called it, didn't just alter reality. It also edited memories to fit the new, absurd version of the world. I felt trapped, not in an apartment, but in my own mind, a mind that was no longer a reliable record of my own life. I spent the first hour in a state of cold panic, tracing the perimeter of the apartment, knocking on the walls, searching for a weak point, an inconsistency in the inconsistency. The windows no longer looked out onto the city. Through the glass, I only saw a swirling gray fog, an endless void. I was in a sealed box, floating in nothingness. The days that followed, if they could be called days, became a lesson in survival in a world without rules. Time ceased to have meaning. Sometimes the light coming through the window was that of a bright day, and a blink later, it was a dark, purple night. The food in the refrigerator would rot and then become fresh again at random. The water from the tap sometimes ran as fine sand, other times as a thick, dark liquid. I learned not to take anything for granted, to examine every glass of water, every bite of food. I lived like a cautious animal in a hostile environment that wore the mask of my own home. And then, in the midst of the chaos, the blurry man appeared. The first time I saw him, it was just a distortion in the air, in the corner of my eye. But over time, his presence became more defined, though never sharp. He was a figure in the shape of a man, but his features, his clothes, everything about him was like a poorly focused photograph. He moved through the apartment with an exasperating calm. He didn't interact with me. He didn't speak. He simply observed. Sometimes I would find him sitting in my armchair when I entered the living room. Other times he would be standing in a corner of the bedroom, a smudge of unreality in my peripheral vision. He was not a ghost. He didn't feel like the echo of a dead person. He felt like a part of the broken logic itself, a personification of the unraveling. Perhaps he was the original poster from the forum, a man who had gone so deep into the dream that he had become part of it. My only anchor to sanity was the computer. Somehow the internet connection still worked, an illogical miracle in my new world. I spent most of my time on that forum, reading the stranger's thread over and over again, searching for a clue, a solution I might have missed. I tried to send him a private message, but his account had been inactive for years. I started reading his other posts on the forum. They were strange, cryptic messages about the nature of perception and the theory that reality only exists when it is observed. And in one of those old posts, I found the key. It was a reply he had given to someone else describing a similar but much milder phenomenon. The message was short and didn't seem like a solution, but a surrender. It said, "The problem is that you're trying to wake up. You fight. You check, you measure reality. But by doing that, you are constantly observing it, and you force the universe to maintain its strangest state. The paradox is that to wake up from a dream, you have to stop fighting it. You have to accept it. You have to stop observing. The only way to escape is to surrender completely." The words were madness. Surrender? Accept that the water was sand and that my door didn't exist? It went against every survival instinct, every fiber of my rational being. But what other choice did I have? My struggle, my checking rituals, my panic had only seemed to accelerate the process, to make the fabric of reality unravel even faster. The blurry man was now almost always present, proof that my resistance was sinking me deeper into the dream. I made a decision, the most terrifying decision of my life. I would stop fighting. It was a process. I had to re-educate my own mind. I sat on the sofa. The blurry man was sitting in the chair opposite me watching. I didn't look away. I didn't try to focus on his features. I simply accepted his presence. I looked at the wall where my door should have been. I felt no panic. I just accepted it as a wall. I picked up a book from the table. The cover showed a bird. I opened it, read a sentence. I looked away for a second, and then looked back. Now the cover showed a fish. My heart skipped a beat, the old instinct of panic. But I suppressed it. I accepted that the book was now about a fish, and I continued reading. For days, or weeks, I don't know, I practiced this surrender. I stopped checking the time. I ate when I was hungry, slept when I was sleepy. My apartment became a surrealist whirlwind. The walls sometimes melted, the colors changed, the furniture floated, and I moved through it all with a strange, empty calm. It was like truly being in a lucid dream, but with the difference that I wasn't trying to control anything. The blurry man was still there, but his presence felt less threatening, more neutral. We were two inhabitants of the same illogical landscape. The climax of my surrender came one afternoon. I was sitting on the floor, and the floor became a meadow of tall grass. The ceiling disappeared, replaced by a sky with two suns. The blurry man was standing next to a tree that was growing where my refrigerator used to be. The old me would have screamed, would have tried to cling to the memory of his apartment. But the new me simply observed the scene. It felt strangely peaceful. And then, I closed my eyes. Not to sleep, but to stop observing completely. I submerged myself in the darkness of my own mind, accepting whatever reality came next, or the absence of it. For the first time since it all began, I stopped being afraid. And then, I woke up. I was in my bed. The light coming through the window was that of a normal, cloudy morning. I sat up, my heart beating with a cautious calm. I looked around. The bedroom was my bedroom. The furniture was in its place. I got up and walked to the living room. It was my living room. And on the wall that faced the landing there was a door. A solid, real front door. I approached it and touched it. The wood was cold under my fingers. I turned the knob. It worked. I opened the door and saw the hallway of my building with its worn carpet and its yellow light. It was the most beautiful sight I had ever beheld. I closed the door and leaned against it. Everything was real. The door is still there. Every day a part of me fears that if I blink it will disappear. Now I have new rituals, not to check reality, but to reinforce it. I touch the doorframe every morning, an anchor in my recovered world. I have learned that reality is not a solid rock, but a fragile fabric that we weave every second with our own perception. Dreams are not what happens when we sleep. They are the logic of chaos waiting for us to stop looking, for us to stop believing strongly enough in the rules. And the worst monster is not the one that haunts you in the dark, but the one that convinces you that the darkness is the only light you have ever known. I rented that house seeking the kind of silence that the city robs you of without you even noticing. I found it in a classified ad, described with a sparseness that I found appealing. Country house, isolated, available for monthly rental. The photographs showed a 2-story stone building, sturdy and unadorned, surrounded by a field that died at the edge of a dense forest. It was perfect. I needed a place without distractions, a sonic void where I could finish my research, and that seemed to be the sanctuary I longed for. The owner, a man of few words with whom I spoke on the phone, assured me that no one would bother me there. "The house has been empty for a while," he said, in a tone I now remember as strangely flat. "It likes its peace and quiet." The first few days were exactly as I had imagined. The silence was almost physical, a dense presence that filled every room. During the first night, I sat on the porch, listening. I heard nothing. Not the chirp of crickets, not the hoot of an owl, not even the whisper of the wind through the trees of the nearby forest. The world seemed to have gone mute beyond the walls of my new refuge. At first, I attributed it to the natural soundproofing of the stone walls and my own urban deafness, accustomed as I was to the constant hum of traffic and sirens. It was a peace that was almost aggressive, and I submerged myself in it with gratitude. Soon, however, that absolute stillness began to feel strange, unnatural. A silence so profound is not a void, but a blank canvas. And my mind, deprived of stimuli, began to paint on it. I heard things, not loud noises or startles, but sonic impressions, so subtle that I doubted my own perception. Sometimes, while reading in the living room, I seemed to catch the sound of a soft exhalation, like a tired sigh, coming from the farthest corner of the room. When I looked up, there was nothing. The silence returned, heavier and more expectant than before. One afternoon, while working at my desk upstairs, I heard the unmistakable creak of a floorboard in the hallway. I froze, holding my breath. It sounded again, closer to my study door. I rose slowly and threw the door open. The hallway was empty, bathed in the pale light filtering through a small window at the end. I walked the entire house then, from the dusty attic to the small basement that smelled of damp earth, searching for a rational source. I was completely alone. I told myself it was the old wooden beams, contracting and expanding with the temperature changes. A logical, reassuring explanation, but not entirely convincing. The house was old, yes, but its noises seemed to have a cadence, an intelligence. The most persistent phenomenon was a cold spot in the living room. It was a specific point near the unlit fireplace, an invisible circle about 2 meters in diameter where the temperature dropped sharply. To keep from going mad, I decided to conduct an experiment. I placed a digital thermometer on the table, which read 21 degrees Celsius. Then I took it and left it on the floor in the center of that area. I returned 5 minutes later. The screen read 14 degrees, a 7-degree difference in the space of just a few meters, with no drafts. I checked again and again, sealing any possible cracks in windows and doors. The cold, however, remained, like a stagnant pool of winter in the middle of the room, a physical anomaly impossible to deny. I began to feel watched. It was a classic sensation, the kind of thing one reads in cheap horror books, but no less real for it. It happened mostly when my back was to a door or to the vast darkness of the living room at night. I would feel a presence behind me, an attentive stillness that forced me to turn around with my heart in my throat. And of course, there was never anyone there. Only the motionless furniture and the shadows they cast, still and silent. This feeling forced me to change my habits. I started to always sit facing the door, to leave lights on in empty rooms, to play music at a low volume, breaking my promise of absolute silence in a desperate attempt to feel less alone, or perhaps more appropriately alone. The incidents became more personal, harder to rationalize. One morning, I went down to the kitchen and found one of my research books, which I had left on the dining room table the night before, placed on the kitchen shelf next to the plates. I had no memory of moving it. On another occasion, while I was shaving, a strange scent filled the bathroom for a few seconds. It was a delicate and old aroma, like dried violets or paper kept for decades in a drawer. It disappeared as quickly as it had arrived, leaving behind only the neutral smell of soap and a new layer of unease in my soul. Living with the inexplicable was becoming my new normal. I tried to ignore it, but the intelligence the event seemed to have made it impossible. One afternoon, while working on my manuscripts, I got up to go to the kitchen. I was gone for less than a minute. When I returned, I saw that one of the pages of my text, which had been face down, had been turned over. In the margin, written in a shaky, old-fashioned script that was not my own, was a single word: leave. I felt the blood run cold in my veins. I blinked, hoping it was an optical illusion, a trick of the shadows. But the word was still there. I brought it closer to the light, observing it from all angles. When I focused my eyes again, the word had vanished. There was no trace of pencil or ink, just the blank paper and a very slight indentation that wasn't there before. But I knew what I'd seen. It wasn't the house creaking. It wasn't my imagination. Something was here with me, and it was communicating. The definitive proof came one stormy night. Lightning intermittently illuminated the house, followed by distant thunder that rumbled dully. I was in the study, trying to concentrate, but the atmosphere was too oppressive. I decided to go downstairs to make some tea. As I passed through the living room, a flash of lightning flooded everything with a white, ghostly light. During that brief instant, I saw the rocking chair by the fireplace, in the exact center of the cold spot, rocking gently as if someone had just gotten up from it. I froze in the doorway, waiting for the next flash. When it came, the chair was completely still. I backed away slowly, my eyes fixed on the rocking chair. I went up the stairs backward, my pulse racing. I entered the study and closed the door, a futile and pathetic gesture. I sat at my desk, trembling. I could no longer deny it. I could no longer look for rational explanations. The house was not empty. I sat there for hours listening to the rain and thunder, but mostly listening to the silence within, a silence I now knew was inhabited. Finally, exhaustion overcame fear. I went to the study window to close it properly. The rain had stopped, and the moon was breaking through the clouds. I looked at my own reflection in the dark glass, my pale face, my eyes wide with terror. And then I saw it. Superimposed on my image, barely visible, like a veil of smoke, was another figure. It was standing right behind me, in the middle of the room. I couldn't make out its features, only the tall, slender silhouette of a woman with long, dark hair. She was motionless, watching me in the reflection. I stifled a scream and spun around. There was no one. The room was empty, silent. All that remained was the cold, which seemed to have intensified, and the echo of her image burned into my mind. I had come to this place seeking solitude, believing that in absolute silence I would find the concentration I needed. Now I understood my mistake. The silence was not empty. It had a dweller. And I, who had longed for the absence of company, now found myself sharing my existence with an invisible presence in a forced and terrifying intimacy that was 1,000 times worse than any noise. The night after seeing her figure in the glass was an inferno of wakefulness. I didn't sleep a wink. I stayed in the armchair in the study, the lamp on, listening to my own heartbeat like a drum announcing a catastrophe. Every creak of the house, every patter of rain on the roof, was her. Every shadow that moved with the wind was her silhouette. My research project, the reason I had sought this isolation, lay forgotten on the desk, a pile of unimportant papers against the overwhelming reality that I was not alone. The pure fear of the first few hours slowly gave way to a different, more complex emotion, a compelling need to understand. Fleeing no longer seemed like an option. Where would I go? And how would I explain that I was abandoning a rented house because I had seen a ghost? I would feel like a madman. Worse still, curiosity, that dangerous and human curiosity, had taken root in my terror. I couldn't leave without knowing who she was and what she wanted. The next morning, with a haggard face and nerves on edge, I made a decision. I would break my self-imposed exile. I drove to the nearest town, a small community about 20 kilometers from the house. It was a sleepy place with a central square, a church, and a handful of shops with sun-faded signs. Before looking for any official records, I decided to try my luck in the only bar that seemed to be open. It smelled of coffee and stale tobacco inside. A couple of old men were playing cards at a table, and the man behind the bar was slowly drying a glass. I ordered a coffee, and after a few minutes of silence, tried to bring up the subject as naturally as I could. "I'm just passing through," I lied. "I noticed the old stone house on the outskirts, the one by the forest. It looks like it has a lot of history." The man stopped drying the glass and looked at me with small, expressionless eyes. "Some stories are best left undisturbed," he said, and his tone ended the conversation. The card players didn't even look up. I understood that there was a pact of silence here, a collective will to forget. My next stop was the town hall, an old building with a small sign that read, "Municipal Archives." Hopefully, I would find something there about the property's history. The woman who assisted me, an elderly civil servant with half-moon glasses, listened to my request patiently. I explained that I was a local history researcher, another lie, and that I was interested in the old stone house by the woods. At first, she shook her head, saying that records for such old properties were scarce or lost. I insisted, describing the house, its isolation, the strange sense of stillness that surrounded it. It was then that I saw a flash of recognition in her eyes. "The house of the silent one?" she asked softly, almost to herself. The nickname sent a chill through me. I begged her to tell me what she knew, that any detail was important. She hesitated for a moment, but finally led me to a back room that smelled of paper and time. After rummaging through an old metal filing cabinet, she pulled out a thin folder. The story she told me, fragmented and mixed with town rumors, was desolate. More than 50 years ago, a young woman named Elira had lived in that house. She was engaged to a boy from the town, a young man named Matteo. A few weeks before the wedding, he died in an accident at the sawmill. Elira, according to the stories, never recovered. She shut herself in the house, refusing all visitors, all help. She stopped speaking entirely. The townspeople, at first with pity, and then with a kind of superstitious fear, began to call her the Silent One. One day they simply saw no more of her. The constable went to the house and found her in the rocking chair by the fireplace as if she were asleep. She had died alone, in silence. "No one has lasted long in that house since," the woman concluded, closing the folder. "They say the silence in there isn't empty." I returned to the house with a heavy heart. The drive back felt eternal. Every tree, every bend in the road seemed to whisper Elira's name. The fear was still present, but now it was tinged with a deep sadness. The ghost of my house had a name and a history. The woman in the reflection was not a monster, but an open wound in time. Upon entering the house, the atmosphere seemed to have changed. The cold in the living room was more intense, more penetrating, and I could have sworn I heard the distant echo of a stifled sob. That night, the phenomena were more direct. On top of my desk, next to my notes, appeared a small lavender flower, dry and brittle. It hadn't been there when I left. It was a gift, an offering, or perhaps a warning. Mustering a courage I didn't know I possessed, I decided to do something. I stood on the threshold of the living room, looking toward the cold spot by the fireplace. "Elira," I said aloud. My voice sounded strange, a desecration of the house's pact of silence. "Are you here?" The only response was an even sharper drop in temperature. The air grew thick, charged with a palpable energy. Suddenly I saw her, not in a reflection, not as a shadow. She was standing on the other side of the room next to the rocking chair. Her image was translucent, like cigarette smoke caught in a moonbeam. She wore a simple dress, and her long dark hair fell over her shoulders. Her face, which I could now see more clearly, was sunk in infinite sorrow. She wasn't looking at me, but at a spot on the wall next to the fireplace. Slowly, she raised a trembling arm and pointed to one of the hearthstones. Then she vanished. I went to the fireplace, my pulse hammering in my temples. The stone she had pointed to seemed slightly looser than the others. Using the tip of a poker, I pried it. It gave way with a crunch, revealing a small dark hollow behind it. I reached in and pulled out a small wooden box, rotted by moisture. I took it to the table and opened it carefully. Inside, wrapped in a yellowed silk handkerchief, was a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. They were her fiancé's letters. I read them one by one, feeling like an intruder in the sanctuary of their love. They spoke of their plans, of the life they were going to build together in that very house, of the children they would have. The last letter was from her, addressed to him, but it was unfinished. "My love," it began, in a delicate script. "I am counting the days until the silence of this house is finally filled with your laughter." The sentence was cut short, like her life, by a small smudge, perhaps a teardrop. In that moment, I understood everything. This was not a vengeful ghost or a malevolent entity. It was a woman trapped in a loop of pain, waiting for a future that never came, a prisoner of the very silence I had come seeking. I returned the letters to their box and placed it back in the hollow, putting the stone back in its place. I couldn't free her. I couldn't change her story. The only thing I could do was respect her grief. My research, my work, it all seemed trivial now. I finished my stay in that house, but my research took a back seat. I spent the remaining days in a strange coexistence with Elira. Sometimes I still felt the cold or saw her fleetingly out of the corner of my eye, a perpetual guardian of her own sorrow. She no longer frightened me. I had become the silent witness to her tragedy, the only one who knew her story. The silence I had sought as a blank canvas turned out to be a finished melancholy portrait, and my role was not to paint over it, but simply to observe it. I left that place having understood that some silences are not meant to be broken, but to be listened to. My job consisted of cleaning up other people's lies. I was a sound editor for a fairly popular podcast on mysteries and urban legends. Every week, the host, a man with a baritone voice and bomb-proof credibility, would narrate stories of ghosts, conspiracies, and internet myths. My task was to take his voice, polish it, and mix it with music and effects to create an immersive atmosphere. I was also in charge of filtering listener emails, a tide of supposed evidence, fake EVPs, and exaggerated tales. 99% of it was junk, a parade of obvious frauds and people with too much imagination. But my job was to listen to that junk, just in case, in that remaining 1%, a gem was hidden. The story that dragged me into the darkness arrived like any other, in an email with a brief subject line, "For your Internet Myths section." The sender had no name, just a series of random numbers. The body of the message was equally cryptic. I don't know if this is real or not, but people are starting to talk about it on some hidden forums. They say it's a sound that finds you. They call it the spectator's frequency. The legend says that if you listen to it 3 times in a row, alone and in complete darkness, something starts to listen to you. Attached to the email was an audio file. It wasn't the first time I'd received something like this. Stories of cursed videos, songs that induced madness, phone numbers answered by the dead. It was all in a day's work. I shrugged and downloaded the file. It was an MP3, barely 30 seconds long. Out of professional habit, I put on my studio headphones, the kind that completely isolate outside noise, and pressed play. There was no scream, no backward satanic message. What I heard was strange. It was a low-frequency hum, deep and constant, with an organic quality to it, as if it were the resonance of a living being. Layered on top of that was what sounded like whispers, but run through so many filters and distortions that they were completely unintelligible. A digital chatter that twisted and slithered just below the threshold of comprehension. It was unsettling, yes, but technically well-produced. A well-made fake, I thought. I filed it away in the possibles folder and got on with my work. Several weeks passed. The Spectator email got buried under dozens of others. One night I was working late. The city on the other side of my window was a tangle of distant lights and silence. I had finished editing the week's episode, and as I poured myself a glass of wine, I remembered the file. Curiosity, that old traitor, got the better of me. The legend was specific, 3 times, alone, in the dark. I was alone. The night was dark. The wine had given me that little push of false courage that often precedes bad decisions. I turned off the studio light, leaving the room plunged into a darkness broken only by the small LED on my computer screen. I put on the headphones, feeling the outside world fade away. I opened the file. The deep hum filled my ears. 30 seconds. When it finished, I played it again. A second time, already feeling a slight suggestibility, a tension in my shoulders. And then a third time. After the third playback finished, the silence that followed felt deeper, heavier. I took off the headphones and sat still, listening. Nothing happened. Absolutely nothing. I laughed at my own foolishness and went to bed. The first sign that something was wrong was subtle. The next morning, as I was making coffee, the machine finished its cycle with the usual final gurgle. But a second later, I heard a repetition of that same sound, much fainter, like an echo that shouldn't have been there. I chalked it up to fatigue. But throughout the day, the incidents repeated. I closed the microwave door and an instant later heard a second, very soft, click. I dropped my keys on the table, and the initial metallic clatter was followed by a ghostly jingle. They were echoes, immediate acoustic echoes of my own actions. They weren't hallucinations. The sound was real, external, but incredibly faint, as if the universe had a slight audio delay. I spent the rest of the day in a state of hyper-awareness. Purposefully making noises, I clapped, I snapped my fingers. And always, without fail, a second later, the ghostly replica would arrive. Panic began to set in. I tried to record the echoes. I set up a high-sensitivity microphone and started making noises. I dropped a book. I coughed. Then, I listened to the recording. I could only hear the original sound. There was no trace of the echoes. The recording only captured reality, not the strange sonic layer that had been superimposed on it. Was I going crazy? Was this some new and bizarre form of tinnitus? The doubt was an acid corroding my logic. That night, I didn't dare turn off the light. I stayed in the living room with the TV on at a low volume, trying to create a barrier of noise. It didn't work. I could hear the ghostly replicas underneath the voices of the presenters, the echo of canned laughter, the echo of a clinking glass. The phenomenon was attached to my perception. The following days were a slow descent into paranoia. I moved around my apartment with exquisite care, trying to make no noise. I ate using plastic cutlery. I became an expert in stealth, but it was useless. The slightest noise had its echo, and the echoes were changing. They were no longer exact replicas. Sometimes, the echo of a closing door would sound a little slower. The echo of my footsteps sometimes added a slight drag I hadn't made. It was as if something was trying to imitate the sounds of my life, but without enough practice. It felt like a mockery. My work became torture. Every sound I processed had its echo in my head, a shadow only I could hear. I started making mistakes. My boss from the podcast called to ask if I was okay. I lied. I told him I was going through a rough patch. I couldn't tell him the truth. The terror took a new leap a week later. I was in the kitchen. The apartment was silent. And then, I heard it. It came from the living room. It was the hum. The same low-frequency hum from the audio file, unmistakable, and over it, the digital whispers. It wasn't coming from my computer, which was off. The sound was simply there, in the air of the room. I stood paralyzed. The sound lasted for about 10 seconds, and then vanished. It wasn't just echoes anymore. The very source of my torment had decided to pay me a visit. It was no longer a passive spectator of my sonic life. It was beginning to generate its own soundtrack in my reality. I knew I had to do something. I needed proof. I needed to prove to myself that I wasn't making it up. The idea that formed in my mind was desperate. If the entity had learned to imitate me, maybe I could teach it to say something I could record. That night, I prepared my studio. I placed the most sensitive microphone in the center of the room, connected to the recorder. I turned off all the lights. I sat on the floor and waited. After an hour, I began to speak. "Hello?" I said aloud. A second later, I heard the echo, a whispered, "Hello." My heart pounded. I pressed the record button. "I want to know who you are," I said, projecting my voice toward the darkest corner. The echo returned, distorted. "Who you are," it repeated, as if struggling to form the words. I kept talking, repeating simple phrases. "What do you want? Why are you here?" And each time the response was an imperfect echo, an increasingly strange imitation. I spoke for nearly half an hour. I felt like a madman, but I knew I wasn't alone. I felt the presence, a cold, focused attention on my words. Finally, exhausted, I decided it was enough. "I am going to listen to the recording now," I announced to the darkness. I stopped the recording. I put on the headphones. I pressed play. I heard my own voice, clear and strong. "Hello?" Then silence. There was no echo on the recording. My heart sank. It was a hallucination. I kept listening, my voice saying, "I want to know who you are." And again, just my voice, followed by pure silence. Despair washed over me. I listened to the very end. My last sentence, "I am going to listen to the recording now." My voice played, and then silence. But this time, the silence wasn't empty. Just before the recording ended, in that last second, a voice that was not my own, that was not an echo, spoke. It wasn't a whisper. It was a clear male voice, incredibly calm and close, as if speaking directly into my ear. And what it said froze the blood in my veins. It said, "And I am going to listen to you." The voice on the recording was a death sentence. I listened to that phrase over and over, headphones clamped to my ears until the words lost their meaning and became pure sound, a vibration of terror. The proof I had so desperately sought brought no relief, only the confirmation of a nightmare. It was real. I wasn't crazy, and something had chosen me as its personal audience, a private show starring only me. The night that followed that discovery was the longest of my life. I got rid of the recorder, tossing it into the back of a closet, as if it were a cursed object. But the sound was no longer on the tape, it was in my memory. The strangest thing was that, from that moment on, the echoes stopped. The phenomenon that had tormented me for days, the ghostly replicas of my actions, vanished completely. Silence returned to my apartment, but it was no longer an imitating silence. It was an observing silence, an expectant silence. It was like being on a dark stage, feeling the presence of a single spectator in the audience, waiting for the show to begin. And the show was my life. The entity, the spectator, became more subtle, but infinitely more invasive. It stopped playing with external sounds and started playing with my internal ones. I began to feel that my thoughts were no longer entirely private. Sometimes, as I tried to concentrate, a background hum, the same one from the original recording, would appear in my mind, drowning my ideas in a kind of mental static. It was impossible to maintain a coherent train of thought. The creature was listening to me think, invading the last private corner I had left. Soon the whispers returned, but they were no longer echoes of my words. They were comments. If I got up to go to the kitchen, a barely audible voice would whisper the word, "thirsty," at the nape of my neck. If I opened the window for some air, I would hear a murmured, "cold." They weren't external sounds. They didn't come from any corner of the house. They were born directly in my auditory canal, little annotations from an invisible observer narrating my most trivial actions. I felt like an insect under a magnifying glass, every one of my movements studied and catalogued. My apartment, my refuge, had become an isolation cell with an invisible warden. I started seeing things, or thinking I did. Shadows moving in my peripheral vision, a distortion in the air in the corner of a room, the feeling that objects had moved by millimeters when I wasn't looking. The terror no longer came from sounds, but from constant anticipation. I lived in a state of perpetual alertness, every nerve in my body taut and sore from lack of rest. One afternoon, in a fit of desperate logic, an idea occurred to me. The legend, the email, it was all linked to the audio file. Maybe if I got rid of the file, the connection would be broken. I went to my computer with trembling hands. I found the file, Truth, or myth37.mp3. I dragged it to the trash, and then, with a click that felt charged with cosmic significance, I emptied the trash. For a moment, I felt immense relief. The humming in my head seemed to fade. I took a deep breath for the first time in days. Maybe it was that simple. The hope lasted exactly until the next morning. When I turned on the computer, I felt a knot in my stomach. There it was. In the center of the desktop, the MP3 file with the same name. It had returned. I deleted it again, this time making sure there was no trace left in any directory. An hour later, it reappeared. I understood the trap. The file was no longer just a file. It was an anchor, a portal, a symbol of my connection to the spectator, and it could not be deleted. The presence became more oppressive. The whispers grew clearer, almost conversational. Sometimes I heard two voices. One, that of the calm man from the recording, seemed to narrate my future actions with chilling placidity. "Now he will get up," it would say in my mind. And I, like a puppet, would feel an irresistible urge to stand. "Now he will walk to the window," and my feet would move on their own. The other voice, the guttural, distorted one from the original file, seemed to laugh, a kind of mocking static that celebrated my loss of control. They were stripping me of my free will, turning me into the protagonist of a story they were writing in real time. I understood I couldn't escape. If I moved out, it would come with me. The infection wasn't in the place. It was in me. I was the receiver. I was the broadcast station. One night, as the narrator's voice guided me to the bathroom, "Now he will turn on the faucet," and the other voice whispered, "Drown," I had a revelation. It was born of absolute despair, an idea so cold and strange it could only arise on the edge of the abyss. The spectator was listening to me. It fed on my reactions, my fear, my actions. It enjoyed the show. And what does a spectator hate most? An empty theater, a canceled show, a story that stops. I couldn't destroy it. I couldn't erase it. But maybe, just maybe, I could bore it to death. From that day on, I began my resistance. It was the quietest and most difficult battle of my life. I quit my job. I cut off all communication with the outside world, and I began systematically to turn off my own life. The first step was movement. I forced myself to remain still for hours. I would sit in a chair in the center of the living room and not move, breathing slowly and deeply. At first, the voices in my head went crazy. The narrator described my immobility with growing confusion. The other voice insulted me, provoked me, projected images of horror in my mind to make me react. But I clung to the stillness, to the chair, to my one act of rebellion. Then, I attacked the sound. I stopped talking. Silence became my weapon and my armor. No more television, no more music, no more kitchen noises. I started eating food that required no preparation, straight from the package so as not to generate sounds. My life was reduced to stillness and silence. Each day was a copy of the last, a crushing, deliberate monotony. The final bastion was my mind. My own thoughts were a source of entertainment for the creature, so I learned to meditate, or a desperate version of it. I focused on nothingness, on a black dot behind my eyelids. I tried to empty my mind of all thought, all memory, all emotion. It was torture. The spectator fought back fiercely. It threw my worst fears at me, the faces of my loved ones, the echo of my failures. But I persisted, building a wall of apathy brick by brick. I became a fortress, a mental desert. I don't know how much time has passed. Months? Years? Time no longer has meaning. I live in a perpetual twilight of stillness. The voices have not disappeared completely, but they are weak, distant like a poorly tuned radio in an abandoned town. Sometimes in a moment of carelessness, a memory or an emotion filters through, and I feel the spectator's attention sharpen, hungry. But I am learning to quickly suppress it, to return to the void. I have won, but my victory is my prison. I have become the guardian of my own ruined mind. I am a closed theater, a stage where no play is ever performed, and the spectator is trapped in the darkness with me, condemned to watch a curtain that will never rise. I don't know if this is living, but I have survived, and I have learned in the most terrible way that some urban legends are true. They are not about ghosts or monsters of flesh and blood. They are about ideas, about frequencies. And once you tune into them, once you truly listen, you can never turn them off. They become the silent spectator that dwells in the darkest corner of your mind, eternally waiting for a show that, if you are lucky, will never begin again. I could never determine if the antique dealer knew what he was selling. His face, a mask of wrinkles and apathy, betrayed nothing more than the tedium of a Tuesday afternoon. The shop was a labyrinth of forgotten objects, permeated by a smell of dust and stagnant time. I had entered with no clear purpose, simply killing time before a meeting that, fortunately for me, had been canceled at the last minute. My eyes, accustomed to seeking symmetry and form due to my profession as a technical illustrator, landed on a dark, almost black wooden case, wedged between a brass theodolite and a collection of rusted fountain pens. Inside, resting on a bed of velvet that had once been red and was now the color of dry wine, lay a compass. It was not like the modern ones made of light steel and plastic. This one was solid iron, heavy and cold to the touch. Its design was austere, almost brutalist, with two thick arms joined by a hinge, adorned with a single symbol I couldn't recognize, a spiral contracting towards a central point. One of the points was a razor-sharp needle, the other, a strange clamp designed to hold a graphite lead with unusual firmness. "Interested?" the antique dealer asked, his voice like the crinkling of old paper. He hadn't moved from his stool behind the counter. "It's peculiar," I replied, weighing the object in my hand. It had a disproportionate weight, a density that seemed to draw in the room's light and nullify it. "Do you know where it's from?" The man shrugged. "It came in a box with other drawing instruments from an architect who died long ago. There's no maker's mark. It's just a piece of old iron. I'll let you have it for 20 euros if you take it now and save me the trouble of putting it away again." I accepted. There was something in its solidity, in its promise of absolute precision, that appealed to me. In my work, accuracy is everything. I draw blueprints, machinery schematics, illustrations for manuals where a millimeter of error can mean the difference between function and disaster. An instrument like that, I thought, was a statement of intent. That same night, I decided to try it. I had to create a series of illustrations for a bearing manufacturer. The job required drawing concentric circles with almost zero tolerance. I unfolded a large sheet of high-grammage paper on my drawing table, adjusted the lighting, and took the compass out of its case. As I loosened the clamp's screw to insert a graphite lead, I noticed the mechanism moved with an oily, silent smoothness, unbefitting of such an old object. I placed the needle in the center of the paper and adjusted the opening. The first strange sensation came at that moment. As I turned the compass to draw the arc, my hand did not guide the instrument. It was the other way around. I felt as if the compass was pulling my fingers, moving with an autonomy of its own, with a speed and fluidity I could never have imparted. The graphite glided over the paper without the slightest friction, leaving a line of a perfect, absolute black. The resulting circle was flawless. So flawless it was disturbing. It was not the work of a human hand, no matter how expert. It was a pure geometric form, a platonic idea manifested on paper. When I ran my fingertip over the line, it felt cold, as if the graphite had lowered the paper's temperature in its path. I dismissed the sensation as an oddity, a product of suggestion. I continued working, drawing circle after circle. Each one was an exact replica of the last in its perfection. The work, which would normally have taken me several hours of strenuous concentration, was finished in less than one. I felt euphoric and at the same time strangely empty, as if I had not been the author of those illustrations. In the following days, the compass's presence in my studio became magnetic. I found myself watching it for long periods, fascinated by its silent blackness. I began to use it for everything, even for preliminary sketches where no precision was required. And that's when things started to deviate from logic. One afternoon, while working on the design of a small garden pavilion for a client, I let the compass guide me, almost as a game. Instead of the straight lines and functional angles the plan required, my hand, or rather the compass, began to trace a spiral. The same spiral engraved on its hinge. It repeated itself over and over, overlapping, creating a hypnotic and complex pattern that seemed to vibrate on the page. When I finally stopped, exhausted and with a cramped hand, I looked at the drawing and felt a deep vertigo. It wasn't a pavilion, it was a map, but of no place I knew. The lines and arcs did not define spaces, but seemed to describe trajectories, flows of something invisible. I tried to discard the drawing, to crumple it up and throw it in the bin, but I couldn't. I felt a physical aversion to the idea of destroying it, as if I were committing a sacrilege. I put it away in a folder, out of sight. My obsession grew. I stopped accepting commissions. I spent my days and nights at my drawing table, compass in hand, allowing it to take me wherever it wanted. The sheets filled with impossible diagrams, with geometries that defied the laws of Euclid. I drew circles that contained themselves in paradoxical ways, angles that twisted into inconceivable perspectives. My walls became covered with these drawings, turning my flat into the sanctuary of a mathematical and insane deity. The effect was not just on the paper. I began to perceive the world differently. I saw arcs and tangents in the falling rain, spirals in the flight of a fly, the hidden geometry in the shadows that crept across the floor. The world was becoming a living diagram, and I felt that the compass was giving me the key to read it. Isolation was the next step. I stopped answering the phone. I ignored the doorbell. My only companion was the iron instrument and the silent whisper of graphite on paper. I started hearing sounds. At first it was a faint scratching, like the tip of a needle being dragged across a stone surface. It came from the walls, the ceiling, the floor. It was intermittent, almost imperceptible, but it was there. One night, while in a state of creative trance, the compass drew something new. It was a plan of my own flat. I recognized the layout of the rooms, the position of the furniture, all with millimetric accuracy. But there was an anomaly. On the living room wall, the one adjoining the lift shaft, it had drawn a door, a perfect circular door, 1.5 meters in diameter, right in the center of the wall. I stared at the plan, my heart beating wildly. The scratching sound became sharper, more insistent. It seemed to be concentrated on that specific wall. I stood up, the compass still in my hand. Its weight felt comforting. Correct. I walked to the living room and stood in front of the spot where the plan indicated the door should be. The wall was smooth, covered in a neutral-toned wallpaper. There was nothing there. I ran my hand over the surface. It was cold, colder than the other walls. And under my fingertips I thought I perceived a very slight vibration, like the echo of distant machinery. Logic screamed at me that it was all a hallucination, that exhaustion and obsession had pushed me to the brink of sanity. But the compass in my hand felt heavy, real, a promise that what was on the paper was the true reality, and the wall, a mere illusion that could be corrected. I raised the instrument. The scratching sound suddenly ceased, leaving an expectant and profound silence that seemed to suck all the air out of the room. I placed the tip of the compass's needle on the exact center of where the circular door should be. I applied no pressure, just rested it there. The tip sank into the plaster as if it were warm butter. There was no sound of breaking, no dust. It simply disappeared into the wall. A shiver ran down my spine. With a tremor I couldn't control, I pushed the compass a little further. The instrument slid inwards, and I felt the wall give way. A thin circular cut of the purest black appeared around the needle. It wasn't a shadow. It was an absence of light. A blackness so absolute it seemed to devour matter itself. I pulled the compass back abruptly. On the wall, a perfect incision remained, a circle the thickness of a hair outlining the door from the drawing. And from that line emanated a cold that was not of this world, and a silence that was not the absence of sound, but the presence of something vast and empty. I had drawn a line in my flat, and I didn't know if I had created a door or an incurable wound in reality. Panic was a wave of ice that jolted me back to reality. I scrambled away from the wall, tripping over a pile of books, and fell to the floor. My mind, which for weeks had been navigating an ocean of abstract geometry, crashed against the rocks of a tangible and terrifying truth. The line on the wall was real. The cold emanating from it was real. My first impulse was to flee, to get out of there, run without looking back, abandon the flat and everything in it. But the compass was still in my hand. Its weight was an anchor, a command. Letting it go required a superhuman effort of will, as if my tendons had fused with the metal. I threw it away from me. It skidded across the parquet floor with a harsh metallic sound and came to a stop under the sofa. I spent the rest of the night huddled in a corner of the kitchen, the room furthest from the living room, with the door closed and a chair wedged under the handle. I listened. The absolute silence that had followed the creation of the circle was broken. Now, from the living room wall, came a new sound. It wasn't scratching. It was a low, constant whisper, like fine sand falling inside an infinite hourglass. It was a dry, ancient sound that spoke of erosion and emptiness. At dawn, the grayish light filtering through the window gave me the courage I needed. I had to get rid of it. I grabbed the compass from under the sofa, not daring to look at it directly, wrapped it in several kitchen towels, put it in a rubbish bag, and ran down the stairs. I threw it into the nearest dumpster and returned home, feeling strangely light, liberated. The sense of relief lasted exactly until I entered the flat. On the drawing table, perfectly centered on a blank sheet of paper, was the compass, clean and cold, as if it had never moved. The wooden case was beside it, open. It was then that I understood that it was not an object that could be owned or discarded. It had its own will, and somehow I was bound to it. Despair gave way to a strange calm, a frigid resignation. If I couldn't escape it, perhaps I should understand it. I decided to go back to the source. I went to the street where the antique shop was. The premises were still there, but the dusty shop window had been replaced by the bright colors of a mobile phone store. I asked the young saleswoman about the antique dealer. She looked at me strangely. She told me that shop had been open for more than 5 years, and before that, it had been a haberdashery run by 2 elderly sisters. There had never been an antique shop there. The world was crumbling around me, or perhaps it was simply reconfiguring itself according to the rules the compass dictated. I returned to my flat, to the sanctuary of impossible diagrams. They no longer seemed insane to me. I was beginning to see the internal logic that governed them. They were not maps of places, but instructions, assembly manuals for a different reality. I picked up the compass. This time I felt no fear, but a sense of purpose. I sat at my table and, instead of letting my hand move at random, I concentrated, trying to ask a question. I wanted to know what it was, what it wanted. Under my intentional guidance, the instrument moved with a new precision. It drew star charts, but the constellations were unrecognizable, arranged in patterns that suggested a celestial vault with radically different physics. It drew what appeared to be creatures, but they were not made of flesh and bone, but of angles, arcs, and interconnected polyhedra, like biomechanical beings from a purely mathematical dimension. And it drew the compass. It drew itself again and again, but in each iteration it showed it connected to a gear, a piston, a cosmic clockwork mechanism of overwhelming complexity. I understood. The compass was not a tool for drawing. It was a piece of an inconceivably large machine, and its function was to replicate itself, or rather, to create the conditions for other pieces to manifest. The circular door in my living room was not an entrance for me, but for something else. The whispering from the wall had become more complex. I could now distinguish notes in it, a kind of dissonant harmonic chant that seemed to modulate in response to the drawings I created. The scratching had also returned, but it no longer sounded like a solitary needle. There were thousands, millions, an orchestra of metallic points working in unison from beyond the walls of my reality, each in its own flat, in its own world, tracing the same lines, building the same machine. I was not alone. I was part of a collective, a worker in a factory that spanned dimensions. My purpose became crystal clear. I no longer fought. I surrendered to the task. For days, which merged into a single endless night, I worked without rest. I ate without realizing it, slept in the chair for short periods, waking up with new geometric formulas bubbling in my brain. The compass was an extension of my being. Together, we filled hundreds of sheets with the final plans. The final work had to be done on the floor of my living room. I moved all the furniture aside, creating a large empty space. And there, with chalk and measuring tapes blessed by the unnatural precision of the compass, I began to draw the definitive diagram. It was an immense circle that took up almost the entire room. Inside it, a network of arcs, spirals, and polygonal lines intertwined, forming a mandala of a terrible and strange beauty. It was the lock and the key, all in one. As I drew the last line, the chanting from the walls reached a deafening crescendo. The air vibrated, and the cold that emanated from the small circle on the wall spread throughout the room, freezing the breath in my lungs. When the diagram was complete, silence returned. A heavy silence, pregnant with expectation. The large circle I had drawn on the floor began to glow with a pale, silvery light. The surface of the parquet floor seemed to turn liquid, like mercury, rippling gently. It was not a hole into darkness. It was a mirror. I looked in. At first, I only saw my own reflection, gaunt, with deep dark circles under my eyes and an expression of fanaticism. But then, my reflection distorted. The features of my face dissolved and were replaced by a structure of bright angles and lines, a geometric face that watched me from the other side. It was one of the creatures from the diagrams. Slowly, one of its limbs rose from the silvery surface. It was not a hand, but a complex appendage, a joint of sharp polyhedra. And at its end, holding it with a precision I knew all too well, was another iron compass, identical to mine. The creature extended its instrument towards me, over the surface of the portal. The fear I should have felt was not there. Instead, I felt a deep sense of accomplishment, of having completed my work. I had built a bridge. I raised my own compass. The metal was hot, vibrant, alive. Slowly, I brought it towards the one held by the being in the mirror, until the two needle points touched right in the center of the portal. At the instant of contact, a discharge of pure knowledge flooded my mind. I saw the immensity of the machine, the galaxies that served as its gears, the universes being born and dying to power its operation. I saw the infinite workers like me in infinite worlds, each opening a small sluice in the dam of reality. We were not slaves. We were priests, and our purpose was not to draw, but to build the pathways. I am no longer the man who bought an old instrument in a shop that never existed. My name and my past are irrelevant. I am a tracer of lines. My studio is no longer my home. It is my workshop. And the door in the living room is no longer a wound. It is the first step. My work has just begun.